Okay, so here is the tutorial for 9.6, solving quadratic equations by using the quadratic formula. So this is going to be our fourth method for solving quadratic equations. Remember, our first method was graphing. Our second method was actually using the square root property. And then our third method was factoring. And now we are going to learn how to solve it by using the quadratic formula. You will like the quadratic formula, maybe not at first, but anytime you're asked to solve a quadratic equation, you can always use the quadratic formula. Whereas sometimes it may be hard to graph or it may be hard to factor, but you can always use the quadratic formula. So I really want you guys to learn this method. I want you to learn the formula. I'm going to talk about a YouTube link that you need to start watching, and it's an annoying song to Pop Goes the Weasel, but it will help you learn the quadratic formula. Not only learn it, it'll help you memorize it. So it's super important for you guys to do that, okay? The review at the beginning of this PowerPoint is on the square root property. It gives you 2 example problems of that. So you guys can look that over as a review. Okay, so we're just gonna jump right in. Our first concept is actually using the quadratic formula. So if you've noticed, I've thrown these slides in just because I'm not there to teach you. I want you to know like when you're starting a new concept. So look for these slides in your notes. All right, and so this is our first concept, using the quadratic formula. And this is what I just said earlier. This is the fourth method for solving quadratic equations. Remember, you're going to get 2 answers for most quadratic equations, okay? So you need to write down this formula in your notes. This is the formula that you need to know and learn and memorize, is the quadratic formula, okay? And this is what it looks like. X equals negative b plus or minus square root b squared minus 4ac, and it's all over 2a. I kind of just keep wanting to sing it to Pop Goes the Weasel, but I don't want to sing it to you guys because it will not be good. But you have to watch that link, and then you can start memorizing this. So here's those hints that I talked to you about earlier, okay? When you start using the quadratic formula, you have to first identify the numbers that represent A, B, and C. Write it down until you get good at this. Then you have to plug those numbers into the formula and solve. You work underneath the radical first and then keep solving. Okay, so let's look at some example problems. Okay, so here's just another slide explaining the quadratic formula. Here's your quadratic equation. Here's your formula, okay? And then I kind of just wrote all these little notes on the side so you can see it. Remember, a cannot be 0 and it cannot be negative, okay? If a is not there, it is 1. So if it's just x squared plus 2x plus 4, a is 1. A also cannot be negative, but that's not something you guys have to worry about right now, I don't think. All right, and green is your assignment. Listen to this YouTube video, and this is on your PowerPoint, so you need to click it, of the quadratic formula, set to the tune of Pop Goes the Weasel. It is annoying, but trust me, you will learn the formula. So just have it on your browser and click it every now and then as you're working these problems for your homework, and just listen to it kind of over and over, and I promise you'll memorize it. And then here are steps for using the quadratic formula, okay? You have to first rewrite the equation in standard form. That's kind of cut off when I printed it. But number 1 is rewrite the equation in standard form. Number 2 is identify the values of A, B, and C. Once you identify those values, you're going to substitute them into the formula. And then you're going to actually solve or simplify. You'll get 2 solutions. And guess what? Last step, you can always check your solutions, put them back into the original equation and see if they're correct. Okay, so here is your first example. We are going to solve this quad using the quadratic formula. And hopefully you can already see the first step you have to take, because by now you've worked these a lot, okay? You have to put this in standard form first. So that means you have to subtract the 35, move it over, and when I do that, I get my quadratic equation equal to 0. Okay, so now it's in standard form. Now I need to identify my A, B, and C. All right, so if this is my quadratic formula, this is my quadratic equation, A is the number in front of x squared. So A is going to be 1 because there's not a number there. So we assume that it's 1. B is going to be -2 and C is going to be -35. Okay, so once I've identified those numbers, I can plug them into the formula. Okay, and here is my formula. And here is a hint. Read this. B is already negative. That's part of the formula. So if you have a negative B in the equation, in the original equation, it's going to become positive after you work that formula. Okay, so this is already negative. You have to make note of that negative. And because now I have a -2 I'm plugging in for B, it's going to make these positive. Okay, so here's my formula. I've identified my values, so now I'm just going to plug in these values where they go in the formula. So like B is -2, so I'm going to put a -2 in for B here and also here in green. All right, that 4, I have a -4 AC. That 4 never changes. It stays the same. That's part of the formula. But I'm going to put 1 in for A because my 1 is A, and then I'm going to put -35 in for C. Okay, so now I just need to start working. And remember my hint earlier is that I have to work everything underneath the radical. Okay, so -2 squared is 4. Going back to right here, remember I have 2 negatives, so they make a +2. And then here, kids always get confused right here at this point, okay? Sometimes this sign is going to be positive, sometimes it's going to be negative. It depends on these numbers, okay? So when I multiply -4 times a +1, I get a -4. And then I'm going to multiply -4 times a -35, and that gives me a +140. So I'm taking that sign down with it. Now, if I were to, for some reason, which I'm sure an example will pop up later, if I get a negative number here, then this is going to be negative. So right now I have 2 plus or minus square root 4 plus 140 all over 2, because 2 times 1, remember I plugged 1 in for A right here, 2 times 1 is 2. Okay, so let's flip over to the rest. All right, so let me see if I can show you this side by side really fast. I don't know if you can see it. Well, I'll just write it. Okay, so this is the point we're at right here. We have 2 plus or minus 4 plus 140 over 2. Okay, so remember I worked the radical first. So 4 plus 140 is 144. And this is the step I'm at right here. Okay, so I'm going to take the square root of 144. And luckily it's a perfect square. The square root of 144 is 12. So I have 2 plus or minus 12 over 2. Here is where I split into my two equations because I have that plus or minus sign. Read my hint. That's what I'm telling you. So I have 2 plus 12 over 2, and then I have 2 minus 12 over 2. Now this is usually mental math. 2 plus 12 is 14. So I have 14 over 2 here. 14 divided by 2 is 7. And then 2 minus 12 over here is actually a -10. So over here I have a -10 over 2, which is -5. And those are my two answers. That's how I solve using the quadratic formula. I always fall back on the quadratic formula. I think I've said that before. I like it better than any other method because you can always use it. It does not matter the type of quad that you're solving for. Okay, now this next example was a multiple choice, but I showed you my work here. I didn't have to put it in standard form. It already was in standard form. So then I identified A, B, and C. A is 1, B is 1, C is negative 30. And then here I plugged it into my quadratic formula. Okay, so my B stays negative here because it was actually a positive, and remember, part of the equation for the quadratic formula, B is negative. So 1 stays negative, and then I have plus or minus. 1 squared right here is 1. Negative 4 times 1 is a negative 4. Negative 4 times a negative 30 gives me a positive 120. So remember, I bring down that positive and I'm adding. So 1 plus 120 is 121, and this is where I'm at right here. And then once again, 2 times 1 is 2. Okay, so here's my equation. Once again, 121 is a perfect square. It is 11. So I have negative 1 plus, well, see my arrows? This is where I'm splitting. I have negative 1 plus 11 over 2. Then I have negative 1 minus 11 over 2. And then I have 10 over 2 and then negative 12 over 2. Okay, that gives me 5 and negative 6. So that is my answer. Okay? All right, let's keep moving. All right, so here is, I feel like these are off. Okay, here's another one that we're solving for, just more practice. Okay, I'm not gonna go over these as much. But here's my equation, and it's already in standard form. So I'm gonna identify A, B, and C. That is super important to do, okay? Is to identify A, B, and C. All right, so I'm gonna plug these numbers into the formula, okay? And I have negative 2 in for B. I'm gonna put positive 2 in for A and negative 5 in for C. And then I'm just solving it from there. Hopefully you can figure it out from here, okay? Now, what is different is I get the square root of 44, and that is not a perfect square, okay? So the square root of 44 is a decimal, okay? So I'm just gonna work it like a decimal. So just maybe round it to 2 or 3 places, whatever you wanna do. And then you're gonna have 2 plus that decimal number over 4, 2 minus that decimal number over 4. And then work that on your calculator and you should get these 2 answers. Okay, now this is kind of the same thing. The only difference with this next example is it's not in standard form. So you have to subtract 4 and bring it over right here, and now you have it in standard form, okay? So I'm going to, these 2 slides are dealing with the same example problem. So I'm gonna identify A, B, and C right here, now that I have it in standard form right there. I'm going to identify A, B, and C, and then I'm gonna plug it into the quadratic formula, and I'm gonna solve. This gives you a perfect square, so you're good here. So you don't have to worry about decimals at this point. But if you look here, so I get, I hope you guys are good. I just haven't been explaining this, but once I plug all of my values in to the formula, I get a positive 8 once I start simplifying. I get negative 8 squared is 64. And then I get negative 4 times a positive 5 is a negative 20. And then negative 20 times a negative 4 is a positive 80. So I'm going to take that positive down. 64 plus 80 is 144. And then if you notice here, we actually had a value for A. So 2 times A would be 2 times 5, which is 10. Okay, so I'm here. So I have 8 plus or minus the square root of 144 over 10. Now, the square root of 144 is 12. So I basically have 8 plus 12 over 10 and 8 minus 12 over 10. Now, these do not give me, this gives me a pretty whole number because 8 plus 12 is 20. 20 divided by 10 is 2, okay? But notice here I don't get a pretty whole number because 8 minus 12 is negative 4. So I get a negative 4 over 10, which is just a negative 0.4. So those are my two answers. So remember, if we talk about a graph, these, when I get two answers like this is where the graph would cross the x-axis, is at 2 and at negative 0.4. So here's another 2 example problems that you can work on your own. So please work these, and then you can check yourself and make sure you're good. Okay, now our second and last concept. Well, no, we have one more concept. But so they're going to have some some homework problems that you get to choose which method you want to use, because now you've learned them all. You've learned how to solve them in different ways, okay? And that's what I say. Now in this section, they are going to have you work different methods for solving quadratic equations. They're going to have you solve by graphing, which was section 9.3. They're going to have you solve by factoring or using the quad formula, okay? So what they do in these next couple examples, they give you this quad to solve, okay? So you're solving the same quadratic equation for these next couple of examples, but you're just using a different method. So the first way they want you to solve this is by graphing, okay? And it does not matter the method you choose to use, you have to put the quad in standard form before you can do anything. No matter which method you use, you always have to put it in standard form. And this is not in standard form. I've got to subtract the 12 and move it over. Okay, now this is standard form. Okay, so now I can start solving. All right, so they wanted me to solve this by graphing. So let me explain graphing, because I know that's something I didn't teach you. So I'll explain it using this quad, but honestly, it's probably one of the harder quadratic equations to do, just because you're working some fractions. But I'll just try to explain how to do it, okay? So here's the quad that I'm graphing. And once again, I've identified A, B, and C. I do that every time. All right. Now, the first thing when you're graph, the first thing you have to do is you have to find the vertex. Okay, because remember, the vertex is either the highest or lowest point. All right, because remember, our graphs are always going to look like this. They're called parabolas. So we have to know where the vertex is so we know where we need to, which values for x we need to use, so we can get the rest of the graph going here. Okay, and I'm going to explain that in a second. So the vertex formula, now this only applies to the x value of the vertex. Remember, if I am graphing a point, there is an x and there is a y. This formula is for only finding the x part, the x coordinate. And that formula is negative b over 2a. Now I know which numbers to plug in because I've already identified them up here. So I'm going to have a negative, and then see, b is negative here. So I'm going to have a negative, and then I'm going to have a negative 5 over 2 times 3, because 3 is my a. Okay, so then I have, so these two negatives just make it a positive. So my x value is 5 over 6. All right. So now that I have my x value of my vertex, I've got to find my y. And the way I do that is I plug it into the original quadratic equation. Okay, so this is me right here plugging the x value in for x and solving for y. Okay, so because it's a weird, like kind of crazy fraction, I just kind of put it in decimal form because I can plot this. It's hard for me to know where 5, 6 is on the graph, but if I put it in a decimal, it helps me see it better, okay? So I get that the y value after I work this math is negative 14.58, okay? And then, so here's my vertex. Remember, I solved for x right here using that formula, and I got it to be 5/6. And then my y is negative 14.58. Now, I go ahead and put this 5/6 in decimal, just so I know where to graph it, okay? And if you look at your PowerPoint, that's the vertex, and those are the points I found, okay? So, now here's the trick. Well, yeah, I guess I can call it a trick. This is, if anybody sent me text about questions on how to graph this, most of the questions were about the XY table. And you have to be strategic. When I've taught you how to graph like a line before, we always use 5 values. We would always use -2, -1, 0, 1, and 2, meaning we would always put those 5 values in for x to get y. Parabolas are different because in order for me to get like the left side of this parabola and also the right side, I have to be strategic in the values that I choose. And so once I know where my vertex is, I choose 2 values to the left of my vertex and 2 x values to the right of my vertex, okay? So I've already chosen those values. These 2 are to the left of my vertex, these 2 are to the right. And I know that just by looking at my graph or just knowing my number line, understanding it. If x is 5/6, which is 0.83, I can choose any point to the left of this to start forming my parabola. So that means I'm going to use 0 and I'm going to use -1 because those are easy numbers to use. Okay, so I chose 0 and -1 to get the left side of my parabola. And then I need to pick 2 points on my right side to find those x values on my right. And the 2 values I chose for my right side were 2 and 4. +2, +4. Okay, I mean, I could have chose 1. I don't know. I just chose 2 and 4, but you can choose any number to the right of that vertex, okay? So then I set up an XY table. Here are my left values, here are my right, okay? I'll just do a little thing like this. Okay, so I'm going to plug 0 into the original equation for x so I can figure out what y is. I'm going to do the same thing for -1, 2, and 4, which is what I drew out here. This is my original equation, and this is me putting in x values in for x so I can get y. So when I solve this, when I put 0 in for x, I get that y is -12. So here's my first coordinate. 0, -12. And I am going to plot that, okay, which is right here. All right. When I put -1 in for x, I get -4. So my second value is -1, -4. I can't tell if you guys can see that. Okay. Now, my third value, which is my first value that's going to give me that right side of the parabola, is 2. And I get, once I put it into my equation, I get -10. So now I have 2, -10, and then I put in 4, and I get 4, -12. So now I have 4 points that I can plot onto my graph, and it will help me get the rest of my parabola. Now, the points I gave don't accurately give me where those x's cross. But if I continue going up, I can maybe guess. I don't know. This is why I don't love the graphing. This was not a good quadratic to graph. But I would have to just keep going and seeing what happens here. Obviously, if I put 3 into the equation, I'm going to get 0 because that's where one of my x-intercepts are. And if I were to put -4/3 into my equation, I would have gotten 0. All right. So now, second method, they want us to solve this by factoring. Once again, it's the same quad that we just graphed, that I just showed you graphing. So we need to factor it. We are going to slide and divide. And I just reminded you how to slide and divide, so I'm not going to go over that again. And when I slide and divide, these are my factors, x minus 3 and 3x plus 4. So I'm going to set them both equal to 0. I'm going to set x minus 3 equal to 0, 3x plus 4 equal to 0, and I'm going to solve for x. Remember, like here, I'm going to add 3, and I get x equals 3. Here, I'm going to subtract 4 from both sides, and then I'm going to have to divide by, sorry, that messed up. I'm going to have to divide by 3 on both sides, and I get x equals negative, you can't see it, 4 over 3. So see, same solutions. Same solutions. This way was graphing, this way was factoring. Okay? So those are two methods. Now, the last thing is solving it by using the quadratic formula. And I don't know why my PowerPoints didn't print off very well. Okay, so now I'm going to solve that same quadratic equation by using the quadratic formula and hope that I get 3 and negative 4 over 3, because I already know those are my answers. Okay, so I identify A, B, and C, put it into my quad, and I just keep working it from there. Okay, follow along on the notes if you're still unsure. But once again, I get 3 and negative 4 thirds. So it doesn't matter which method you use, you should get the same answer. But like I said, a quadratic equation, you can always use that. And to me, it's easier sometimes than factoring, or most definitely by graphing. Okay, so learn how to do it. If you get anything else out of this section, that's what I want you to get. Okay, so you'll be able to choose your method. Here is just a summary of the methods that you've learned in Chapter 9. The only one is I did not teach you completing the square, so you do not have to do that. But we've learned how to solve a quadratic equation by factoring, graphing, using the square root, and the quad formula. Okay, this was 9.3. This was 9.4. This was also 9.4. We did both of these in the same section. And then this is this section, which is 9.6, I think. Okay. All right. So that's your second concept. Last concept for this. Last concept for this section. So they've given you this that you could use. This is an example problem where you can pick your method. All right. And that was your answer. So you can check yourself. All right. Last concept is using the discriminant. So you need to know what the discriminant is. Okay, so the discriminant is the expression underneath the radical that's part of the quadratic formula. Okay, and that's what I'm showing you right here. Okay, so this actually said, why use the quadratic formula? The quadratic formula allows you to solve any quadratic equation. Even if you cannot factor it or graph it, you can always fall back on the quadratic formula. An important piece of the quad formula is underneath the radical, this, b squared minus 4ac. This is called the discriminant. So in this part of the notes, or this part of your homework, you can do what we call working the discriminant, and you will be able to know exactly how many solutions the equation is going to have. If it's going to have 0, if it's going to have 1, or if it's going to have 2 solutions. Okay, that's why we use the discriminant, is to see that. Okay, so this is kind of what I just said. Why is the discriminant important? And it's because it tells you how many roots you can have. Okay, so let's look. If I work the discriminant, and remember, discriminant is b squared minus 4ac. If I work it and I get a negative number, there are no real solutions. Make sure there's water. Make sure there's still water. If I work the discriminant and I get 0 as my answer, there is one real solution. If I work a discriminant and I get any type of positive number, there are 2 real solutions. Okay, so let me just show you some examples of that. Okay, it says state the value of the discriminant, and then here is your quad. Okay, once again, this is not standard form. You have to subtract 12 and move it over. Okay, so once I subtract 12, this is what I get. I get my quad formula in standard form, so now I can work the discriminant. all right, I still identify A, B, and C. A is 3, B is 10, C is negative 12, okay? So I'm going to plug it into the discriminant, which is right here in this box, okay? So I'm going to put 10 in for B, I'm going to put 3 in for A, and negative 12 in for C. Then I'm just going to work it, okay? Work 10 squared. And then you have to multiply negative 4 times 3, which is negative 12. Negative 12 times a negative 12 is a positive 144. So you basically have 100 plus 144, because by multiplying all these together, it gave me a positive. Remember, it's the same way because you're just working the part underneath the radical from the quadratic formula. 100 plus 144 is 244. This is a positive number. That's all I look at, is positive. So this equation is going to have two solutions. It's not asking me to find the solutions, it's just asking me how many solutions it has. And because I got a positive number here, it has two solutions. Okay? All right. So, example 4. Okay? I just kind of worked it for you. It was a multiple choice. But they want me to state the discriminant and tell me how many solutions it has. This is already in standard form. I get A is 1, B is 2, C is 2. Just by looking at my equation. 1, 2, and 2. Then I'm going to plug it into the discriminant right here. Okay? I work the discriminant and I get that the discriminant is negative 4. Okay? So remember, if I get a negative number as the discriminant, there's no solutions, because think about where it is in the formula. If this is underneath the radical and I work the section underneath the radical and I get a negative number, I cannot take the square root of a negative number. So it's going to be an error. It's going to be no solution. So if I get a negative number as the discriminant, there is no real solution, okay? And then I just gave you another example problem here that you can look over. So I hope this makes sense to you. Remember, with these problems, you're going to practice using the quadratic formula to solve these quadratic equations, and then they're going to have you work the discriminant a little bit. And we only use the discriminant to figure out how many solutions. We're not solving it and getting answers for x. We're just saying, okay, this equation has one solution. This equation has 0 solutions, or this equation has 2. So good luck. Here's your assignment.